Have you ever looked into the shadows and felt like someone was watching, even though they shouldn't have been there? Back in 2023, in a quiet village tucked deep within the Scottish Highlands, a family experienced something they still cannot explain to this day. It all began just 2 weeks after an elderly grandfather tragically died in a fatal car accident. The family was still grieving, trying to process the sudden loss, when something strange started happening outside their home. One cold evening, as fog slowly rolled across the hills and the sun disappeared behind the highlands, the neighbor's 4-year-old daughter was playing in the yard with other children. Suddenly, she stopped, smiled, and began waving toward the far end of the property. At first, nobody thought much of it, but then the little girl quietly asked, "Why is that old man standing over there?" The adults looked toward the misty edge of the yard, but they saw nothing. The child continued waving and smiling, as if she was having a normal conversation with someone only she could see. According to her, the elderly man seemed confused. She said he kept asking why nobody would talk to him, and why everyone was ignoring him. Over the next several days, the girl repeatedly mentioned the same man. Every evening around sunset, she claimed he would quietly appear near the yard, simply watching the family in silence. Concerned and deeply unsettled, the family eventually decided to test something. Without giving the child any hints or explanations, they showed her several old family photographs. The moment she saw one particular picture, her expression changed instantly. She pointed directly at the photograph and said, "That's him. That's the man in the yard." The room fell completely silent. The man in the photo was the grandfather who had died only 2 weeks earlier. What made the experience even more chilling was the fact that the little girl had never met him before. She had no way of recognizing his face. To this day, the family still cannot explain what happened during those strange evenings in the Scottish fog. Was it simply a child's imagination? Or was it possible that the grandfather, confused after his sudden death, returned one last time searching for the people he loved? In Scotland, stories like this are more common than many people realize. From ancient castles to lonely highland villages hidden beneath endless mist, the country has long been associated with ghost sightings, unexplained encounters, and eerie paranormal legends passed down for generations. And perhaps that is what makes Scotland so hauntingly unforgettable. Because sometimes, in places filled with history, grief, and silence, the line between the living and the dead may not be as far apart as we think. The Weiss family arrived in the Bavarian countryside just before autumn settled over the hills. Their new home stood isolated between endless fields and a dense pine forest outside a forgotten village in southern Germany. The farmhouse was old, built from dark timber and stone, with creaking floors and windows that rattled whenever the mountain wind passed through. Locals rarely looked toward the property, and when they did, it was with uneasy silence. Clouds permanently hovered above the valley, as if the sun itself avoided the land. Every evening, fog rolled across the fields and swallowed the wooden fences surrounding the property. Anna, the youngest daughter of the family, seemed strangely fascinated by the lonely atmosphere. While her parents unpacked boxes and argued about repairs, the 6-year-old spent hours staring out at the empty farmland behind the house. On their third evening in Bavaria, Anna disappeared just before dinner. Her mother found her standing beside an old wooden fence at the far edge of the field. The child was smiling softly, whispering to someone hidden behind the thick fog. But when her mother called out, Anna turned around alone. "Who are you talking to?" her mother asked nervously. "The old man," Anna answered calmly. "He says he used to live here." Her parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. They assumed it was an imaginary friend inspired by the strange new environment. Still, something about Anna's expression felt wrong. She wasn't pretending. She looked as though she were listening carefully to someone standing directly beside her. The next morning, Anna described the old man in perfect detail. She said he wore a long gray coat covered in mud, carried a rusted lantern, and smelled like wet soil after rain. Most disturbing of all, she said his eyes looked sad and empty. Her father laughed it off, but her mother noticed fresh muddy footprints outside Anna's bedroom window leading toward the field. That night, the wind became violent. Rain hammered the farmhouse roof while thunder echoed through the valley. Around midnight, Anna quietly climbed out of bed and walked outside barefoot into the storm. Her older brother saw her through the hallway window and screamed for their parents. The family rushed outside carrying flashlights into the freezing rain. Near the wooden fence, illuminated by flashes of lightning, Anna stood face to face with an old man. He appeared thin and pale, his body partially transparent beneath the storm clouds. His hollow eyes reflected no light, and water passed through his clothing as though he wasn't fully there. The family froze in horror. Anna continued speaking to the spirit peacefully, while the old man slowly pointed toward the center of the field where a broken scarecrow leaned crookedly in the mud. The creature's jaw moved unnaturally, producing a dry whisper carried by the wind. "He wants to go home," Anna said softly. Her mother grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away, but Anna suddenly spoke with a deeper voice that did not belong to a child. "They buried me where the crows stopped singing." At that exact moment, every light inside the farmhouse exploded. Darkness swallowed the countryside. The storm intensified violently, and the family could hear faint cries echoing across the field like distant voices trapped underground. The following morning, shaken and exhausted, Anna's father went into the village searching for answers. An elderly innkeeper turned pale after hearing the description of the spirit. He revealed that decades earlier, an old farmer named Elias Kruger had vanished mysteriously after accusing his own relatives of trying to steal his land. No body was ever found. Against police advice, the family insisted investigators search the field behind the farmhouse. They dug near the broken scarecrow while storm clouds gathered overhead once again. Only a few feet below the soil, workers uncovered a human skeleton wrapped in fragments of a gray coat and rusted chains. The village fell silent after the discovery. Records confirmed the remains belonged to Elias Kruger. He had been murdered and secretly buried on his own property nearly 40 years earlier. The case had remained hidden because everyone involved was either dead or too afraid to speak. That evening, for the first time since arriving in Bavaria, the sky cleared. Moonlight spread softly across the fields, and the wind finally stopped whispering through the trees. The oppressive feeling surrounding the farmhouse disappeared completely. Before going to bed, Anna stood quietly beside her bedroom window, staring toward the wooden fence. Her mother approached carefully and asked what she was looking at. Anna smiled faintly. "The old man says thank you," she whispered. Far beyond the field, under the pale moonlight, a shadowy figure in a gray coat stood beside the fence for one final moment before slowly fading into the drifting Bavarian fog. The town of Black Hollow, Texas, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and nothing ever seemed to change. Old pickup trucks lined the dusty streets, country music drifted from distant porches, and the sunsets painted the sky in deep orange and crimson every evening. It felt peaceful to outsiders, but locals carried stories they rarely shared after dark. The Carter family had lived in the same white wooden house for generations. Behind the house stretched a wide backyard filled with dry grass, an old swing set, and a line of oak trees that bordered an abandoned ranch. Every evening, neighborhood children gathered there to play while parents watched from lawn chairs with glasses of iced tea. 4-year-old Lily Carter loved the backyard more than anyone. She spent hours chasing fireflies and talking to imaginary friends while the older children laughed nearby. Her parents thought it was harmless childhood imagination, but over time, they began noticing Lily often speaking to someone near the trees at the edge of the property. One warm evening during sunset, Lily suddenly stopped running and waved excitedly toward the oak trees. The golden light of dusk stretched long shadows across the yard, while cicadas buzzed loudly in the heat. Her older brother looked toward the trees but saw nothing there. "Who are you waving at?" he asked. "The old man," Lily answered happily. "He says he's lonely." The adults exchanged nervous smiles, trying to ignore the chill that suddenly spread through the air. But Lily continued staring toward the same spot every evening, always smiling as though someone familiar stood waiting for her beneath the trees. A few days later, Lily began describing the old man in disturbing detail. She said he wore denim overalls covered in dirt and a wide cowboy hat with a torn brim. His face looked pale like paper, and his voice sounded broken and tired. Most unsettling of all, she claimed he always smelled like smoke. Her grandfather overheard the conversation and nearly dropped his coffee mug. Quietly, he pulled Lily's father aside and asked exactly where the child kept seeing the figure. When they pointed toward the oak trees, the old man's face turned ghostly white. Decades earlier, before the neighborhood existed, the land belonged to an elderly rancher named Walter Green. According to local legend, Walter died in a fire that destroyed his ranch house near those same trees. Some believed it was an accident. Others whispered that he had been trapped inside intentionally during a dispute over his property. That night, Lily woke her mother just before midnight. "The old man is outside again," she whispered. Her mother looked through the bedroom window and froze. Standing near the trees was the faint outline of an elderly man illuminated by moonlight. His body appeared transparent, almost blending into the darkness. The figure remained perfectly still, staring toward the house. The next evening, several family members gathered in the backyard, determined to prove Lily was imagining everything. Children played normally while the adults watched the trees nervously. As the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, Lily suddenly waved again. Then they saw him. A transparent elderly figure stood between the oak trees, barely visible in the fading sunlight. His body flickered like smoke, and the outline of a burned cowboy hat rested on his head. The temperature dropped instantly despite the Texas heat. One of the children began crying. Lily walked slowly toward the figure while her mother screamed for her to stop, but the little girl simply stood a few feet away from the spirit, listening carefully as though the old man were telling her a secret. "He says they left him there," Lily said softly. The ghost slowly lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward a patch of ground near the oldest oak tree. For a brief second, the family could hear faint crackling sounds like distant fire burning in dry grass. The next morning, police arrived after hearing the family's story. Though skeptical, officers searched the area beneath the tree roots. After several hours of digging, they uncovered charred human remains buried deep beneath the soil, alongside rusted belt buckles and fragments of burned ranch tools. The discovery shocked the entire town. Records confirmed the remains likely belonged to Walter Green, whose disappearance had never truly been solved. Evidence suggested he had escaped the fire but was murdered afterward and secretly buried near the property line. As news spread across Black Hollow, strange things around the Carter home suddenly stopped. The cold spots vanished. The feeling of being watched disappeared. Even Lily no longer spoke about the old man near the trees. Several nights later, during another blazing Texas sunset, Lily stood quietly in the backyard one last time. Her mother watched nervously from the porch as warm wind moved gently through the grass. Lily smiled softly and waved toward the oak trees. Far in the distance, a transparent figure tipped his burned cowboy hat before slowly fading into the golden evening light, finally disappearing with the setting Texas sun. Snow fell endlessly over the quiet neighborhood in Quebec, Canada, covering rooftops, parked cars, and frozen streets in thick white silence. The Beaumont family home stood at the end of a narrow road lined with bare maple trees, their dark branches swaying beneath the pale winter sky. Inside the warm house, old family photographs decorated the walls, reminders of relatives long gone. 8-year-old Claire Beaumont loved listening to her grandmother's stories during snowstorms. Wrapped in blankets beside the fireplace, she spent hours looking through dusty photo albums filled with black and white pictures of family members she had never met. One photograph caught her attention more than the others. A portrait of her late grandfather, Henri Beaumont, standing beside a frozen lake in an old wool coat. Claire stared at the photograph carefully. "That's the man outside," she whispered. Her grandmother froze instantly. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Claire pointed toward the front window where snow drifted heavily beneath the streetlights. Standing motionless across the road was the faint outline of an elderly man wearing the exact same wool coat from the photograph. His figure looked pale and almost transparent against the falling snow. By the time the adults rushed to the window, the figure was gone. The family tried convincing themselves it was only a reflection or a trick of the storm. Henri Beaumont had died nearly 15 years earlier after suffering a heart attack during a brutal Quebec winter. Claire had never met him. She had only seen a few old pictures stored in boxes upstairs. Yet over the following days, Claire continued seeing the elderly figure outside the house. Sometimes he stood quietly near the mailbox. Other times he appeared beneath the street lamp at the edge of the driveway while snow covered his shoulders. He never moved aggressively. He simply watched the house in silence. Claire was never afraid of him. "He looks sad," she told her mother one evening, "like he's waiting for someone." Her parents became increasingly disturbed when Claire started describing personal details about Henri that nobody had ever told her. She mentioned his pocket watch, his favorite pipe, and even the scar near his left hand from a logging accident decades earlier. Her grandmother turned pale every time the child spoke. One freezing night, a powerful snowstorm swept across the neighborhood. Wind howled through the trees, while ice struck the windows like tiny stones. Around midnight, Claire quietly walked downstairs and opened the front door. Her mother woke just in time to see footprints leading into the snow. Panicked, the family rushed outside into the freezing darkness. Snow swirled violently beneath the streetlights as they searched the neighborhood, calling Claire's name. Then her father spotted her standing barefoot at the edge of the road, staring toward the frozen park across the street, and beside her stood the old man. The figure appeared clearer than ever before. His face was pale blue from the cold, his breath absent in the winter air. Snowflakes passed directly through parts of his transparent body, yet his eyes looked painfully human, filled with grief and exhaustion. Claire slowly reached for his hand. "He says Grandma never found his letter," she whispered. The spirit raised one trembling arm and pointed toward the old storage shed behind the house. Then, for a brief moment, the family heard the faint sound of a ticking pocket watch echoing through the storm. The next morning, shaken but desperate for answers, Claire's father searched the frozen shed. Hidden beneath loose wooden boards, he discovered a small rusted metal box covered in dust. Inside was an unopened letter written by Henri shortly before his death. The letter revealed a heartbreaking secret. Years earlier, Henri had planned to leave the family home behind and move away after falling deeply into debt. Ashamed and afraid of disappointing his wife, he hid the truth and died before he could explain himself. The letter apologized for the burden he believed he had become and confessed how much he loved his family. Claire's grandmother broke down crying after reading it. For years, she had believed Henri abandoned her emotionally before his death. The letter changed everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved for 40 years. That evening, the storm finally passed. Snow rested peacefully across the neighborhood beneath a clear silver moon. Claire stood quietly beside the living room window, holding the old photograph of her grandfather. Outside, near the street lamp, the transparent figure appeared one final time. Henri Beaumont smiled gently toward his family. Then, as soft snow drifted through the silent Quebec night, his figure slowly faded into the winter darkness and disappeared forever. Snow fell endlessly over the quiet neighborhood in Quebec, Canada, covering rooftops, parked cars, and frozen streets in thick white silence. The Beaumont family home stood at the end of a narrow road lined with bare maple trees, their dark branches swaying beneath the pale winter sky. Inside the warm house, old family photographs decorated the walls, reminders of relatives long gone. 8-year-old Claire Beaumont loved listening to her grandmother's stories during snowstorms. Wrapped in blankets beside the fireplace, she spent hours looking through dusty photo albums filled with black and white pictures of family members she had never met. One photograph caught her attention more than the others, a portrait of her late grandfather, Henri Beaumont, standing beside a frozen lake in an old wool coat. Claire stared at the photograph carefully before slowly pointing toward the living room window. Outside, beneath the flickering street lamp and drifting snow, stood the faint outline of an elderly man wearing the exact same coat from the picture. His figure appeared pale and transparent against the stormy night. "That's the man outside," Claire whispered softly. Her grandmother's face immediately turned pale. She slowly approached the window with trembling hands, but by the time the adults looked outside, the figure had already vanished into the snowfall. Only untouched snow and freezing wind remained in the empty street. The family tried convincing themselves it was only Claire's imagination. Henri Beaumont had died 15 years earlier after suffering a heart attack during one of Quebec's harshest winters. Claire had never met him in her life and knew him only through old photographs stored upstairs in dusty boxes. Yet over the following days, Claire continued seeing the mysterious old man outside the house. Sometimes he stood silently near the mailbox. Other times he appeared beneath the maple trees across the road, staring toward the family home without moving. Snow collected on his shoulders, but he never seemed affected by the cold. Claire was never frightened by him. One evening during dinner, she calmly told her mother, "He looks lonely." The little girl explained that the old man never spoke loudly, but she could somehow understand his sadness whenever he appeared outside in the snow. Her parents became deeply disturbed when Claire began describing details about Henri nobody had ever told her. She mentioned his silver pocket watch, his smoking pipe carved from oak wood, and even the scar on his left hand from an accident at a logging camp decades earlier. Her grandmother nearly dropped her teacup in shock. One freezing night, a powerful snowstorm swept across the neighborhood. Wind rattled the windows violently while ice scraped across the roof like fingernails. Near midnight, Claire quietly left her bedroom and walked downstairs toward the front door without waking anyone. Her mother woke moments later and discovered the front door slightly open. Tiny barefoot footprints stretched into the snow-covered street. Panic spread through the house as the family rushed outside into the freezing darkness, calling Claire's name through the storm. Then her father spotted her standing near the frozen park across the road. Beside her stood the transparent figure of an elderly man, illuminated beneath the pale streetlight. His face looked thin and ghostly blue, while snowflakes drifted through parts of his body like mist. Claire slowly reached toward him as though greeting an old friend. "He says Grandma never found his letter," she whispered. The spirit slowly raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the old storage shed behind the Beaumont house, before lowering his head sadly. The following morning, desperate for answers, Claire's father searched the frozen shed. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, he discovered a rusted metal box untouched for decades. Inside was a sealed handwritten letter addressed to Claire's grandmother in Henri's handwriting. The letter revealed a heartbreaking truth. Before his death, Henri had secretly fallen into massive debt and planned to leave town to protect his family from financial ruin. Ashamed and terrified of disappointing his wife, he hid his struggles until the very end. The unfinished letter contained an apology and a final confession of love to his family. Claire's grandmother broke down crying after reading the letter aloud beside the fireplace. For years, she believed Henri had emotionally abandoned the family before his death. Now, after 15 years of grief and misunderstanding, she finally understood the pain he had carried alone. That evening, the storm finally passed. Moonlight reflected across the untouched snow, while silence returned to the quiet Quebec neighborhood. Claire stood beside the living room window holding the old photograph of her grandfather close to her chest. Outside beneath the street lamp, Henri Beaumont appeared one final time. He smiled gently toward his family as soft snow drifted around him. Then, slowly and peacefully, his transparent figure faded into the winter darkness and disappeared forever.